Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our Feed Your Mind and Body series, where today we will be talking about soups. We all know what soup is, but if you've only ever eaten soup from a can or from a restaurant, we're here to show you how simple it can be to make a pot of soup as a meal or as a side for your family using cheap ingredients and techniques that will be easy even for beginners. First, I'd like to mention a few terms you will be hearing that you may not be familiar with. Mirepoix, traditionally diced carrots, onions, and celery that is a base for soups and sauces. Roux, equal parts starch and fat cooked together as a base and thickening agent for soups and sauces. Bouillon pretty much means the same thing as broth and stock, which is a savory liquid in which vegetables, meats, fish, or other things have been boiled, and all of the material has been removed, leaving behind just the flavored water. Bouillon can be reduced or dehydrated, so you could buy bouillon cubes or paste in the store and just rehydrate it to make your own broth base. A simple vegetable soup or chicken noodle can be thrown together for less than $10. The fancier your ingredients, the more it'll cost, but it's not unreasonable to make a pot of minestrone soup for a family of 4 for about $10. There's an old folk story, Stone Soup, about a town of starving people putting their meager food together in a pot to make a delicious soup to feed everyone. And though the moral of the story is more about sharing and the sum being greater than the parts, the fact that people having all kinds of random bits of food coming together could really only work well in one dish, and that is soup. It is incredibly cheap, versatile, hearty, and you can boil a bunch of food in a soup for long enough no one notices that your contribution was just a stone. So without further ado, Sam is going to show you how easy it is to make a chicken noodle soup, and afterward I will share my grandfather's not so special but utterly delicious potato soup.
Hello, today we're going to go over a chicken noodle soup recipe that I found online called literally the best chicken noodle soup. Not sure if that's true, but it is pretty good. You're going to need 2 tablespoons olive oil, 4 large carrots sliced, 4 large celery stalks sliced, 1 small onion diced, 3 garlic cloves minced, 2 tablespoons fresh thyme with the stems removed, salt and pepper to taste, 10 cups chicken broth, 12 ounces of wide egg noodles, 2 cups shredded chicken, and 2 tablespoons fresh parsley. So you're going to start by dicing your vegetables, carrot, celery, onion. This is also known as a mirepoix, which is a French term you may see used in many soup recipes. A mirepoix is made from diced vegetables, usually carrots, onions, and celery, but it can include others as well. These vegetables are then lightly cooked but not browned in order to add a flavor base to the soup. So we still want them to be soft, but not too soft. So we're going to saute them until tender, about 4 to 5 minutes. Then we'll add the garlic cloves, the fresh thyme, and salt and pepper and saute for 1 minute more. Remember, you can always add more salt and pepper, but you can't take it away. After those are softened, we will add in our 10 cups chicken broth and the egg noodles. We'll bring to a boil on high heat. And then once it's boiling, reduce to a simmer. Let the noodles cook until al dente for about 10 minutes. Then we will add in our chicken. I used up my leftover chicken from the night before, but you can start with raw chicken. You will want to cook it ahead of time in another pan, or you can actually cook it in the pot with your vegetables early on. But this was a great recipe to use up my leftover chicken. Add in the chicken, fresh parsley right before serving. Continue to simmer until the chicken is heated throughout. And add more salt and pepper to taste, and there you go. A very simple, easy recipe, perfect for leftovers. So making a soup should not be intimidating. You can actually experiment, make your own soup from scratch using leftovers that you have. All you'll need is a fat to cook with, like butter or oil. Start by cooking your vegetables in that. You'll need a base for your liquid. Meat or vegetable stock is great. Cream or tomato paste, you name it. If using a cream though, you will want to wait to add that later because you do not want to burn it. If you're adding meat, use whatever you like. If it isn't pre-cooked, make sure you cook it. Otherwise, leftovers work great. Vegetables always help round out a soup, fresh or frozen, whatever you like. Spices are a must. Salt and pepper at least, but herbs, fresh or dried, work well. You can also add pasta grains or legumes. Saute your vegetables in the fat and cook your meat if necessary. Add your liquid. Except for milk or cream, let simmer for an hour or two and enjoy.
Do you love potatoes as much as I do? I'm going to show you the very easy potato soup recipe my mom made when I was growing up, taught to her by my grandfather. But I'll also tell you a variety of ways you can personalize it, because that's what's great about making your own soups. First, I'm going to make about enough for 4 servings, so I'm using about 3 pounds of russet potatoes. You can use golden potatoes too, which will have a milkier, smoother texture, but I like the starchiness and added thickness that the russet potatoes lend to a soup. When my mom made this recipe, she used 10 pounds of potatoes because we wanted it for every meal for days afterwards, loving that it got thicker and thicker each day in the fridge until it was almost mashed potatoes in the end. My recipe is simple. For my 3 pounds of potatoes, I'll use 1 large onion or 2 small onions. Garlic is optional, but I've got to have my garlic. I chop the onions and garlic first because the potatoes help to pull the odor off your hands a little bit. You want a rough chop for the onions, no more than 1/2 inch in size. I dice the garlic, not perfectly, just enough to spread the flavor around. Then I peel all the potatoes, a task which was once given as punishment, and I understand why. Next, I chop all the potatoes. I learned long ago that it doesn't matter how big or small your potato chops are, as long as they're relatively the same size. Bigger pieces will take longer to cook, but as long as they're all big pieces, you should be okay. The same applies to smaller pieces. Keep them close to equal. This is especially true if you're baking or frying potatoes. It's less true with soup because they'll cook longer than the minimum for doneness anyway, but it's still best to keep them all the same size. All soups are going to start off with a fat and a vegetable base. Whether it's Mirepoix or another combination, it is the first layer of flavor for your soup. Different soups do well with different fats. For a thick and starchy soup like potato, I prefer to use butter. You can also use oil if you prefer that. I'm going to be making a roux for this soup, so I'm going to put in more butter than would be necessary to cook the onions. A roux is a mixture of starch and fat to make a paste that is the base for a sauce or a soup. The ratio of starch for a roux is 1:1 starch to fat, so equal parts. If I put in 1/2 cup of butter, later I'll add 1/2 cup of flour as my starch. Here, I'm heating up my onions alone with the butter. I don't want to brown them or caramelize them. I just want to cook them until they soften up. I don't want crunchy onions in my potato soup. This will take a few minutes and I have to stir them frequently or they'll brown. Once they are the desired consistency, I'll add the garlic. Due to its smaller dice, the garlic is going to cook quickly, so I add them at the end of this process. I mix it into the onions and let it cook for a minute or two, and that's it. This is where I will make a roux. You use a roux in soup to thicken it. If you add the flour after the stock, the flour will clump and not mix well. Adding the flour to the fat makes a paste, which dissolves better in the stock so that the flour is more equally distributed throughout the soup and not in little nuggets floating on the top. So because I started off with a half a cup of butter, I'm adding a half a cup of flour. This gives me an oniony paste in the pan once it's all combined. Next is the stock. I almost always use chicken stock unless a recipe specifically calls for vegetable or beef stock. Now, you can use homemade stock, canned stock, boxed, or bouillon. I prefer bouillon, and I prefer the Better Than Bouillon brand. It is concentrated paste that comes in small jars that you keep in the fridge, and you add it to hot water to create a stock. This dissolves really fast in hot soup. I want to add 10 cups of warm water to my soup, which sounds like a lot, but some of it's going to cook off as steam. So I add the warm water to the pan, then the measured amount of bouillon, and mix until it's incorporated fully. When the stock heats up, I add the potato chunks. I season pretty heavily at this stage with salt, pepper, and thyme. If I were using fresh herbs, I'd add those in the end, but dried thyme goes in with the potatoes for me. For this recipe, everything is now in, and I'm going to let it cook for an hour or two, stirring frequently until my potatoes are very soft and even breaking down a little bit. The soup is almost done, and there are a couple more decisions that go into finishing it. This is when I could add milk or cream to the soup to give it a milky bisque base. I could leave it as is and have hundreds of little bite-sized potato chunks all through it. I could blend the whole thing in a blender or with an immersion blender to give it a super thick consistency with no lumps. But what I prefer is to blend half and leave half. You can do this by removing a few cups of soup and blending that, and then adding it back to your pot. Or you can use an immersion blender and buzz away at the soup for a little bit until you have potato chunks, but the stock itself is dense. To me, this is ideal, and I love using my immersion blender whenever I have an opportunity. Last is when you add things like bacon bits, green onions, fresh herbs, things like that. I prefer to wait until the soup is ladled into a bowl to add cheese, so it doesn't make the whole pot cheesy and stringy. However, it's been a long time since I made my grandfather's potato soup, which is actually a very generic potato soup recipe, no secret ingredients or tricks involved, and I'm going to have it without toppings. Soups that aren't as starchy as this is pair well with breads, crackers, tortilla chips, and other starchy additions. This one's already dense, so I don't want to add anything else starchy to it. So really, homemade soup is a series of decisions. What type of stock do you want? What type of fat will start the base? What type of vegetables will be included in the base? Do you want meat, and if so, what kind? What spices will you add? Will you add dairy? Should there also be toppings? And that's it. Aside from chopping and starting your meat or base, there isn't a whole lot of work involved, and there's even less if you put this mix in a crock pot or an Instapot. I should add, some people like to cook low and slow all day long, and others prefer their vegetables to still have a little bit of bite to them. It depends on you, and it depends on the type of soup you're making, but it doesn't have to take 8 hours to make a good pot of soup. Just remember to let it cool and refrigerate the leftovers right away. Soups go rancid or sour fast if not stored properly, and some vegetables turn bad faster than others. So always make sure you're not eating rancid soup. We thank you for joining us for our Feed Your Mind and Body soup program. Next month, join us where we will show you all kinds of things you can make with dough.